The Internet and eating disorders. The evolution of a phenomenon. Eating disorders such as anorexia, bulimia, and orthorexia are among the most serious mental health conditions, intertwining issues of control, identity, and body perception. Just a few decades ago, they developed in silence, but today, they are able to thrive online. The Internet has not only enabled individuals struggling with eating disorders to connect with others, but has also created a space in which the illness can be normalized or even aestheticized. This shift from a private experience to a public discourse has fundamentally transformed the nature of the phenomenon. Eating disorders have come to function not only as a medical issue, but also as a cultural and digital one. To understand how this happened, it is worth examining how the structure of the Internet itself has evolved and how users have begun to talk about the body, food, and control within it. Early Internet, anonymity, and the rise of illness communities. Years 1995 to 2010. The first online spaces dedicated to eating disorders emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s, primarily in the form of forums and blogs. Some of these served a supportive function, allowing individuals to connect and reduce feelings of isolation, what is often described in the literature as peer support communities. Over time, however, more closed and distinct subcultures began to form, commonly referred to as pro-ana and pro-mia communities. Within these spaces, eating disorders ceased to be viewed solely as health problems and instead began to function as elements of identity, lifestyle, and even a shared language. This was not accidental. It was largely a result of the architecture of the early Internet. Forums and blogs grouped together individuals with highly similar experiences, often without external context or moderation. In practice, this meant that people struggling with the same issues entered a closed environment where their perspectives were not challenged by alternative therapeutic or health-oriented narratives. From a social psychology perspective, this can be explained by mechanisms such as homophily and group reinforcement. People naturally gravitate toward those who are similar to them, and in closed environments, beliefs tend to become more extreme. As a result, the experience of illness begins to foster a sense of belonging and understanding. At the same time, research, including publications in eating disorders, the Journal of Treatment and Prevention, indicates that anonymity and lack of moderation facilitated the emergence of spaces where pathological behaviors became socially normalized. This process involves transforming individual experiences of illness into elements of group identity, which can make recovery more difficult. Another powerful psychological mechanism at play was the need for control and meaning. Eating disorders are often associated with a perceived lack of control over one's life, and online communities offered an alternative narrative in which control over the body was framed as agency and strength. Within a group that continuously reinforced this narrative, it was easy for it to evolve into something more than just a symptom of illness. This led to the creation of an environment where individual experiences were amplified by others, and the boundary between support and the reinforcement of destructive patterns became increasingly blurred. These spaces were also characterized by strong symbolism and communication rituals. Users developed coded language, pseudonyms, and recurring visual and linguistic motifs. These often centered around themes of lightness, control, and transformation. One of the most recognizable symbols was the butterfly, representing both fragility and aspirational bodily transformation. It is important to note that, for many participants, these spaces were not perceived as inherently toxic. They often represented the only place where individuals could openly talk about their experiences. This duality, offering both support and reinforcement of harmful behaviors, became a central focus of research on eating disorders in digital contexts. During this period, the Internet was not yet strongly algorithm-driven. Content spread primarily through user choice, making interactions more social and closely tied to individual experiences. Tumblr and the aestheticization of suffering, years 2010 to 2015. The next phase in the evolution of this phenomenon is closely tied to visual platforms, particularly Tumblr. Research on eating disorder communities shows that this period marked a significant qualitative shift. Between 2010 and 2015, Tumblr became one of the primary environments for pro-ana content. Unlike earlier text-based communication, the platform relied heavily on visuals, short-form imagery, quotes, and curated fragments of everyday life presented in aesthetically pleasing formats. Content related to eating disorders became coded both visually and linguistically. It did not always explicitly promote illness, but often presented it in a stylized, minimalist, and emotionally detached way. This is where the concept of thinspiration emerged, content that did not necessarily directly encourage disordered eating, but constructed a visual ideal of an extremely thin, controlled body. These included images of body parts, silhouettes, minimal meals, and were often paired with emotionally charged phrases about discipline, persistence, or loneliness. However, the key transformation went beyond subject matter. Eating disorders began to be framed not as a problem, but as an aesthetic experience. In academic literature, this is described as the aestheticization of suffering, which is a process in which something inherently destructive is repackaged into a visually appealing, coherent, and easily consumable form. Studies from this period, including publications in cyberpsychology, behavior, and social networking, indicate that this form of content had a particularly strong impact. Images operate faster than text, are more intuitive, and harder to critically evaluate. Exposure to such content has been shown to increase body dissatisfaction and intensify body-checking behaviors, especially among at-risk individuals. Tumblr also introduced a mechanism that would later become standard across social media: the ease of content replication. A single image could be shared hundreds of thousands of times, losing its original context and becoming part of a larger, repetitive visual pattern. As a result, a new type of environment emerged: the environment without a clearly defined community in the traditional sense. Instead, it consisted of a distinct aesthetic language made up of images and associations that together formed a coherent, though often unnamed, narrative about the body and control. However, what was still largely user-driven on Tumblr would soon be transformed by something far more powerful: TikTok. When aesthetics meet the algorithm, years 2015 to present. With the rise of platforms such as TikTok and later Instagram and YouTube, a fundamental shift occurred. Users no longer actively sought out content. It was the content which began to find them. The For You page model means that the online experience is shaped by dynamic algorithmic selection rather than conscious user choice. This is where the previously developed aesthetic, including that from Tumblr, meets a mechanism capable of amplifying it at scale. Content appears in an endless stream without a clear beginning or end. Research, including WHO reports and analyses in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, highlights that users are not just consuming content, but they are actively drawn into its ecosystem by recommendation systems. This marks a crucial difference from earlier stages of the internet. On forums, users had to seek out communities. On Tumblr, they had to engage with a specific aesthetic. On TikTok, a few seconds of attention are enough. In this context, formats such as What I Eat in a Day, Fit Routine, Fitspiration, and broader wellness content become particularly significant. On their own, they are often not extreme or overtly problematic. However, their impact does not stem from individual messages, but from repetition. Algorithms can present hundreds or even thousands of similar videos featuring idealized bodies, lifestyles, and routines. This creates the impression that such lifestyles are the norm, rather than one of many possibilities. The boundary between inspiration and pressure becomes increasingly blurred as content is no longer balanced by alternative perspectives. Research on diet culture and social media suggests that this type of content promotes the internalization of narrow dietary norms, increases focus on food purity, and contributes to dietary restraint. At the same time, the rise of fitness and wellness influencers deepens this subtle form of pressure. Unlike earlier content, contemporary material is rarely extreme and is embedded within the language of health and discipline. In this framework, the body becomes a product or a project of optimization. This is often described in academic literature as a self-optimization culture, in which individuals are expected to continuously improve themselves across multiple dimensions. As a result, the line between health and control becomes increasingly difficult to define, as both begin to operate within the same discourse. Are platforms trying to address the problem? In response to growing public criticism and scientific research, platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube have introduced various measures to limit eating disorder-related content. One common approach is restricting or blocking certain search terms. In many cases, entering obvious eating disorder-related phrases leads users to support resources or mental health information. However, the internet adapts quickly. Instead of one keyword, 10 new ones emerge, and these are often altered, abbreviated, or coded. Research shows that users frequently bypass moderation by creating coded language that remains understandable within the community but invisible to detection systems. A second level of intervention involves removing content that directly promotes eating disorders. Platforms claim to actively moderate pro-ana, thinspiration, and similar materials. The challenge, however, is that contemporary content is rarely so explicit. Much of today's eating disorder-related content operates in a way that does not formally violate platform rules, yet still reinforces specific ways of thinking about the body. Internal analyses by Meta have also shown that teenagers who are more dissatisfied with their appearance are exposed to significantly more of this type of content than their peers. Algorithms actively amplify exposure to content related to appearance, dieting, and control, particularly among individuals who are already vulnerable. In some studies, users with eating disorder tendencies received several times more such content than control groups. A problem that has transformed, not disappeared. In retrospect, it is difficult to speak of simple progress or resolution. The key transformation does not lie in what content exists, but in how it is distributed. Today's users no longer need to actively seek it out. A few interactions, a few seconds of attention, are enough to be drawn into a stream of repetitive messages about the body, food, and control. The most extreme and explicit content has largely disappeared or moved into closed communities. In its place, more subtle, harder to detect forms have emerged and are far better aligned with contemporary visual culture. The internet may no longer openly promote destructive behaviors, but it continues to feed us content that exists at the boundary between control and discipline, and framed in the socially acceptable language of health and self-care.